Okay, so we're going to start with Macbeth, a bit quicker and easier for us to sort of focus really on the key context, and most of it is obvious. So when you're saying you don't know the context and you're finding it's really difficult, it isn't difficult, you already know it. You're just streamlining it in to whatever point it is that you're making. So the key things, and this is something I don't think we've gone through. So Macbeth was written, and we know that when we're talking about writer's purpose, it's written at a time to reflect what is going on at the time. And that's, for context, always what we're talking about. How is the writer sort of reflecting society at that time? He wrote a lot of plays prior to Macbeth. And that was the time when Queen Elizabeth was in control. Queen Elizabeth was the rightful heir. She was good, everything was great, and plays like Midsummer Night's Dream, all the really funny, romantic, fairy, wonderful plays were written, which kind of demonstrated the confidence in the Queen at the time, the love and the happiness felt in society. What then happened is, the plays that he wrote during the reign of King James, which we know who was the king at the time that Macbeth was written, all of his plays switched and became really, really dark. And that was to sort of represent this sort of cynical insecurity that they had over King James being the king, because he was not the natural order. He was not the rightful heir to the throne. So there was a lot of belief that actually he should never have become king. And we'll talk about and go back through the natural order, but we know what we know about the natural order, and actually, if we believe the wrong person, everything in the world is going to fall apart, and he shouldn't have been king. So there was lots of uncertainty over how he came to power, that he shouldn't be in power, and that we as a society are really unsettled. So that's our first thing that you could identify that covers context. The fact that the mood of this play is dark. The fact that we have superstition, murder, power, royalty. That piece of context can potentially drip into whatever the question is going to be. Then we can move on. This is tiny just because it's more for me as a reminder, really. Remember that Macbeth, keyword, dramatic tragedy. So we're talking about Macbeth as a play, and it follows a 5-act structure, which again is quite common for a tragedy. We have Macbeth, who is our protagonist. The witches are kind of that catalyst that drive all these things that happen to him in the play. So we can identify the fact that it's a dramatic tragedy to reflect what was going on in society. That's your context. That can be your opening line, you've covered context. So it's really simple to just fit in there. We've talked about this before, so we have Hamartia. Who can remember what that is? Karina? Thank you. A character's fatal flaw. So what was Macbeth's Hamartia? What was his flaw? That ambition, the power, that want and that drive. And essentially, that flaw that a character has is what causes their downfall in a tragedy. So again, it's really obvious, we've talked about it, that's actually all the context. Because he's fitting the stereotype of that style of play. Yeah?
Do we just use the context of the essay?
Yes. Yes. So lots of things that we can talk about here. So I've got in Macbeth's case, it's his ambition, that drive for power that leads to his downfall. Perhaps you could say his trust and his belief in his wife, also easily manipulated, those kinds of things lead to his downfall. We then have another term, catharsis, which is essentially this idea of cleansing emotions. So, and I can put this on Firefly for you, but Macbeth starts to self-destruct. Lady Macbeth starts to self-destruct because it's important that we can cleanse. We know this at school. We can go and we can confess and we can have that moment really of cleansing the sins that we have. He doesn't get to do that. And that then sort of eats away at his character. This term is taken from hundreds of years ago. It's context. Okay, so it's a simple thing to just dip in. And then the great chain of being, which we know about. So the events that are taking place in this play all fall apart because we don't have the rightful king. Macbeth almost reflects King James's position in society at the time. Because we've got King James, who shouldn't have been the king because he wasn't the rightful heir, actually ruling at the time Shakespeare wrote this. Then he's got Macbeth taking over the throne when he shouldn't have taken over the throne. So there's quite a strong, almost political message there that he's giving out as to what's potentially going to happen to someone who tries to take on the throne when they shouldn't. Because look at what happens to Macbeth. He's not the rightful king. He's not a good king. He's indirectly saying that to King James. There are concerns for King James. So again, if the question is about Macbeth, you can use that as a bit of context and a reflection between them. We know in terms of our chain of being that then when the rightful king or queen isn't in place, what happens to the order? That natural order in the world? It all falls apart and it goes crazy. How's that shown in Macbeth? When he becomes king, what happens?
The weather changes and like the horses fly.
Yeah, remember the Porter scene where the weather changes, they have the worst storm they've ever had, the horses are eating and attacking each other and everything. Everything in their world is turned upside down. That's context. That's what they believed. The wrong person is on the throne. Everything's going to fall apart because who chooses the king? God. And if the wrong person is in that powerful position, God is angry and he's going to do what he can to get that corrected. Context shown in the events of the play. Then what can we remember about the gunpowder plot? Do we know what was he trying to achieve? Yeah, so again, this huge gunpowder plot, trying to prevent someone from becoming king, trying to prevent, to blow up the Houses of Parliament. That's context. That happened. So we can relate this idea to what people are trying to do and the lengths that people will go to in order to remove them from that position. And we have all of these armies that come and attack Macbeth and will do everything they possibly can to get him removed because it's that important to do so. Now, you could also make connections contextually between the character of Macbeth and King James and the fact that they're both potentially considered as, you know, not the right, strong, powerful leaders. And I think my next one is about, witchcraft. So if we're talking about superstition, we're talking about witchcraft, we're talking about King James. Can anyone remember what he did? What did he write a book about? Witchcraft. So we have a king who shouldn't really be the king in charge at the time, writing books about witchcraft at a time when we believed in witches. The whole basis for the events of this play, the whole catalyst that drives Macbeth, are those three witches. They're in the opening scene. They are the most important characters. That's why they're in scene one. That's a structure mark. Because you're saying it's happening in the opening scene and we've got the storm and that sets the tone for the whole of the play. So we have there, again, Shakespeare reflecting King James's beliefs that, you know, witchcraft is almost, his wasn't a warning against witchcraft. King James I was almost sort of like intriguing people to read about it and to understand about it. But society at the time was very much terrified of those female characters, or any females who had any ability out of the norm. Like, we just didn't do that. And we know what happened to witches, and we know how they were treated, and we know how they were tried, and ultimately, whichever happens, if someone calls you a witch, you're going to die. It's just whether it's by drowning or by being burnt. There's no sort of escape from that. So we have an opening scene with 3 witches. Contextually, that's so important, because the whole play is about witchcraft and how they ruin Macbeth and everything in the play. And at the time, superstition was feared. Witches were treated, or women that had any sort of power or anything, that's how they were treated. What's really interesting, if you want a different angle, I would make the argument that Lady Macbeth is the 4th witch. Because Macbeth, as we know, possesses all the qualities that women are not supposed to have. She's manipulative, she's powerful, she controls him, she is greedy, she wants to become queen, she wants to have that. That's not what a woman should be doing, because at the time, women are there to reproduce, to marry, to be seen and not heard. And you've got this character who doesn't have any of those qualities. She's terrifying. We would have been terrified of her. And a lot of people would have argued and seen the qualities that she had as witchcraft. There's something, you know, it's not right. So you can sort of then make that argument. She was way too ambitious. And perhaps that was her downfall. That her fatal flaw was that ambition and that drive destroyed her. She again couldn't cleanse. She was trying to wash that blood out of her hands all the time. She was trying to cleanse herself. She couldn't do it. She died. So there's no positive messages to the audience at the time about going against the kind of grain of society. This is reflecting a time when they felt really, really unsettled with the king, and it completely comes out in this play. Does that make sense? Yeah? Okay. Any questions on Macbeth before we do an Inspector Calls? Because there's more for an Inspector Calls. Go on, Darina.